Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Uninvited, a first-person point-and-click adventure game developed by ICOM Simulations and published by Mindscape for the Macintosh computer platform in 1986, with ports to a variety of other platforms like the Amiga, MS-DOS, Atari ST, Commodore 64, and, most pertinent to our discussion today, the Nintendo Entertainment System following in later years. We're going to look at that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch, Bandicoot, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into Uninvited, I figured it'd be a good idea to let everybody know why I chose Uninvited for today's episode. And the fact is, we kind of talked a little bit about at least one of the reasons why I chose Uninvited during last episode, because the simple fact is, it is almost Halloween. Historically, I have not really done anything special for many of the holidays that occur throughout a year. I've tried in the past to kind of intersperse some things, and certainly around the holiday times, we do our free Patreon episode to everybody. But outside of that, I haven't really done anything thematically around different holidays around the year. This year was going to be no different. I didn't have any spooky games planned for October. I had a different roadmap in mind. I had different games planned out, and I just figured, well, I'm just going to release my episodes. And then as it started getting a little bit closer to Halloween, I figured, well, wait a second. Maybe I should do something a little bit spookier. We've talked about spooky games before, but we never really talked about spooky games around Halloween. So I decided to do a little bit of a pivot and decided to add in a couple of spookier, though not really super scary games, as we'll talk about later on during this episode, because last episode we covered A Nightmare on Elm Street, which of course is the Rare title that was based on the very popular and long-running film series, and then today we're going to talk about Uninvited. So for those of you who may be newer listeners or may not have played these games back in the 80s, you might be wondering, what the heck is Uninvited? And the fact is that Uninvited is one of a series of games created by a company called ICOM Simulations. It's part of their MacVenture game series. We're going to talk about all of that and what that means a little bit later on. But effectively, you can think of the MacVenture games as being very early point-and-click adventure experiences on the Macintosh computer platform. This is a big deal because back when these MacVenture games were created, and there were four, there was Deja Vu 1, followed up by Uninvited. I believe Shadowgate came next, and then Deja Vu 2. I think that was the general chronology, but regardless, there were four games in this MacVenture series, and almost all of them had been ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System. The only one that wasn't was Deja Vu 2, which I'm pretty sure I talked about this during my episode on Deja Vu, but the fact that Deja Vu 2 was never released on the NES was a heartbreaker for me, because I loved Deja Vu. And over the years, I would actually play Shadowgate as well. And I didn't realize at the time that both Deja Vu and Shadowgate had been made by the same company, that they were ports of that same MacVenture series. Back then, I played Deja Vu, I played Shadowgate, I never played Deja Vu 2 because at the time I was not really into computer gaming, which is where Deja Vu 2 had primarily been released. But I had played those two games, Deja Vu and Shadowgate, and I never even knew that Uninvited existed. I legitimately didn't even realize there was another game. I probably walked by and saw it sitting on store shelves and just thought to myself, okay, I guess that's a game. But I never really went to it because remember, back then, there weren't websites like Wikipedia. There weren't websites with stores of information where you can go out to and you can say, hey, I liked Deja Vu. I like games like Deja Vu. Can you give me other alternatives or suggestions? And have that website say, oh yeah, well, you realize that the company that made Deja Vu actually made a bunch of other games and they're all in a similar style. There was nothing like that. So I didn't even realize that Deja Vu and Shadowgate were made by the same company, let alone recognizing that there was another game out there that I had never played. I really enjoyed the NES incarnations of Deja Vu and Shadowgate, and in later years, I would eventually go back and play the original versions of those games. I played Deja Vu 1, I played Deja Vu 2 because, like I said, I had missed that one entirely since it had never really come out. It did have a release on Game Boy Color later on, I believe, which I still have not played. I've not played that version of the game, which was done in the same kind of style as Deja Vu for the NES. But I never went back to play Deja Vu 2 on a Nintendo system, a port. I just basically played the original Macintosh version and I was happy with that. And I have, of course, played Shadowgate. But even after going back to play the original Macintosh versions of the game, and I'm talking black and white graphics, barely any audio, that version of the game, I went back and I played those, but I still hadn't played Uninvited. And I thought to myself, well, why? Why haven't I played Uninvited? I've enjoyed every other MacVenture game. This is a personal blind spot for me, and I wanted to complete the set. Plus, it's spooky season, and I knew Uninvited was based on the fairly common haunted house kind of trope. So I figured this was a perfect opportunity to finish off my ICOM Simulations collection. So I was going to play Uninvited, and of course, I needed to do it on the NES because I wanted to rekindle the nostalgia that I had for that style of gameplay. I loved it from when I was a kid, and I wanted to re-experience that style of gameplay while experiencing a brand new game to me. As I sat down to begin playing Uninvited, I did have a question though. Will Uninvited hold up as well as my love for Deja Vu and Shadowgate? Or should I have continued avoiding Uninvited, content with my memories for arguably the most well-known MacVenture titles, those being Deja Vu and Shadowgate? That is the question we are going to attempt to answer today. Uninvited is a first-person point-and-click adventure title developed by ICOM Simulations and published by Mindscape for the Macintosh computer platform in 1986, with ports to a variety of other platforms following in later years, including the Nintendo Entertainment System. Before we can talk about Uninvited, we need to take a step back to talk about the company behind the game, ICOM Simulations, and how their early efforts created what would become one of the first point-and-click adventure titles of all time. Now first, I should mention that a lot of this history is going to be very familiar to anybody who has listened to our episode on Deja Vu, simply because history is history. You can't rewrite it, despite what some people may try. And Deja Vu was the first MacVenture game released by ICOM Simulations. Uninvited was the second. So certainly we'll talk about Uninvited specifically, but a lot of the background history is really going to be shared between those two games. Anyway, before we get to Uninvited, we need to go even further back to talk about the Apple Macintosh, a computer platform that would take the world by storm back when it was first released back in 1984. The Apple Macintosh was dubbed as a computer for the general population, and all you need to do is take a look at its design and the design of its interface to understand why the Macintosh was being marketed as a personal computer for general users, not necessarily hardcore technology aficionados. Unlike most computers released in the early 80s, which primarily used text-based displays and esoteric command-line entries to perform simple tasks, the Macintosh was created from the ground up to be a graphical computer system, complete with files, folders, and applications being visually depicted on the computer's screen using icons, graphics, and nested hierarchies as opposed to purely text. And rather than interacting with your computer by typing commands on your keyboard, you would instead navigate this new virtual environment using a computer mouse, which at the time of the Macintosh's release was not a ubiquitous user input device. The Macintosh was designed in such a way that anyone could sit down and begin using the machine. You didn't need a degree in computer science. You didn't need hard-backed, spiral-bound notebooks to understand how to actually use the darn thing. You didn't even need to be particularly tech-savvy in order to get some enjoyment out of the device. If you could move a mouse cursor across the screen and click a button, you could use a Macintosh. The only question was, how were you going to use your Macintosh? Because, as most people likely realize, the capabilities of any computer system are limited by the software you have at your disposal. If you need to balance your checkbook, then you need to get a personal finance program. If you wanted to write a best-selling novel, well, you'd need a word processor. If you wanted to play a riveting new game, you'd need to buy and install that game on your computer. If you wanted to create a new game, though, well, that one was a little bit trickier. In nearly every episode of this podcast, we've talked about how various developers got their start creating games. And in most of those discussions, we've focused on incredibly talented programmers who taught themselves how to bend computers to their will through a mix of determination, genius-level technical know-how, and sheer willpower. But in nearly all instances, those discussions focused on a degree of technical knowledge and expertise that most typical computer users simply don't possess. There's a reason why most people buy software instead of make software, and that's because the barrier to entry for actually creating computer programs, especially in the early 80s, was exceedingly high. You couldn't sit down and whip up a brand new application or game without extensive preparation, learning, and expertise, even if you were using your brand new, for everyone, Apple Macintosh. The simple fact is, some tasks were too difficult for the typical computer user. Interestingly, there were some individuals who believed that even complex tasks like game development could be accomplished by the general layperson, even those individuals who may have no understanding as to how to program a computer. The only thing that was missing was the right tool to let an individual's creativity run wild. This is exactly where a man named Bill Appleton comes into our story. Bill Appleton's career started a little bit differently than most of the individuals we've spoken about in prior episodes, in that as a youngster, he didn't really have any particular drive or desire to enter the computer industry, and in fact, his college-level educational pursuits were anything but technology-centric, as he primarily studied philosophy, painting, and economics, which are about as far removed from software development as any set of interests could possibly be. And actually, Appleton was so good at economics that after he graduated college in 1984, he was offered a graduate fellowship with Vanderbilt University as a means to entice him to continue his economics studies. Appleton received that proposal, which was quite frankly an amazing opportunity to continue his education, and then decided to forego it entirely, as he basically said thanks, but no thanks, and then moved back in with his parents, where he ended up living in the basement of his family's home, a somewhat unexpected, if not stereotypical, move for a recent college graduate. Now, you might be wondering why someone with such potentially lucrative opportunities in front of him would decide to instead move back home to live under a house. And the simple answer to that question is the Apple Macintosh. Like we talked about, the Apple Macintosh was released in 1984, and as soon as Appleton saw that new, user-friendly, sleek and sexy machine, he knew his life had changed forever. He became enamored with the Apple system and began to consider that perhaps he could begin making software for the new device, specifically adventure games, despite the fact that he didn't have any software development experience to speak of at the time that he made that declaration. That did not stop him from diving headfirst into the Apple Macintosh ecosystem, though, and after spending nearly all of his savings on a shiny new Mac, he was ready to begin making his adventure game creation dreams a reality. Only that would prove to be significantly more challenging than what you might expect, as the Apple computer ecosystem was a bit less integrated than what it might have appeared to the general user population. You know how today, if you want to develop a piece of software for a computer, all you need is the computer itself, as well as a software development toolkit of some kind. Back in the early days of the Apple Macintosh, however, that degree of simplicity wasn't there, even though the Macintosh was designed to be a simple-to-use machine. No, instead, if you wanted to create software, applications, and games for the Macintosh, you needed to own a different Apple machine, the Apple Lisa, which served as the development system for the Apple Macintosh ecosystem. This, as you might expect, would have been a sizable investment, as Apple Lisa machines cost significantly more money than a traditional Macintosh. And unless you were already a proven software developer with potentially lucrative ideas and skills, it wasn't likely you were going to spend the money to purchase a Lisa. Appleton, having no software development skills himself, wasn't ready to take out a loan just to buy another computer. But what he could do was learn everything he could possibly learn about Macintosh development, and over the course of a year, he would devour all sorts of technical manuals and software development guides in the hopes that one day he'd be able to put that newfound software development skill to good use. As luck would have it, though, Appleton would make the acquaintance of Elaine Rossman, an Apple employee whose job at the company was to expand the amount of software available for the new machine, and in order to do that, the company needed to recruit software developers to begin making software for the platform. Even though there was a process for doing just that, which, like we just discussed, involved purchasing an Apple Lisa, that was proving to be a tough and expensive barrier to entry for many developers. For their part, Apple began to loosen those restrictions just a little bit in the year following the Mac's release, which is what would lead Rossman to provide Appleton with a copy of the Mac Assembler program, a tool that would allow anyone with the right software development know-how to create games for the Macintosh, even if they didn't own an Apple Lisa. Well, even though Appleton didn't have much hands-on software development experience, he did have software development knowledge, as he had just spent the better part of the last year teaching himself everything there was to learn about developing for the Macintosh. Now that he had the proverbial key to the Macintosh kingdom, and the knowledge required to use that key, the only thing left to do was begin creating software. And like we talked about, Appleton had one goal in mind when he began his Macintosh self-learning journey back in 1984. He wanted to create an adventure game. Only here, he didn't want to create just any old adventure game. He wanted to do something revolutionary. We have talked about adventure game history before, and in particular, we've discussed the early efforts of both the purely text-driven adventure game genre, as well as some of the innovations introduced by other pioneers in the industry, most prominently Ken and Roberta Williams, who would themselves evolve the purely text-based adventure game interface to include graphics, an influential and incredibly important development in the adventure game genre. Online Systems, and later Sierra Online's earliest titles would marry graphics-driven viewports into a game's world with the fairly traditional text-driven parser that was standard around the time, creating the world's first series of graphically enriched adventure games. Still, despite the inclusion of graphics in these early titles, the interface itself remained a decidedly text-driven affair, and even though players could now see the game world and its characters, actually interacting with that world and those characters was anything but revolutionary. Appleton recognized the inherent limitations in what was then modern adventure game design, and considered, what if he was able to marry the graphical and mouse-driven capabilities of the Apple Macintosh into a singular adventure game package, where players would be able to actually point and click their way through a narrative-centric adventure game? Sure, some commands would still require text-based inputs, but by and large, interacting with the game world would be accomplished solely using a mouse, a concept that, while not entirely new in the broader computer game industry, was something that had never been attempted before in an English-language game. Appleton thought this idea had merit. The only problem was, designing an adventure game from scratch, using Macintosh assembly code, might not actually result in the best game design. Sure, it could be done, and Appleton himself had the skills necessary to accomplish such a feat. But Appleton didn't want to deliver a mediocre, albeit innovative, adventure experience. He wanted to create something truly timeless, and in order to do that, he considered that he would need an adventure game design toolset to turn his vision into reality. The only issue was, well, there wasn't an adventure game design toolset available to general consumers in 1985. Which meant one thing: Appleton would have to create his own from scratch. This is what would lead to the creation of World Builder, which has been credited as being the world's first multimedia authoring tool ever released for the general consumer market, and which would also be the first piece of software Appleton ever created. World Builder was created to allow anyone to create their own graphically enhanced point-and-click adventure games, and it was designed to intentionally take advantage of the Macintosh's inherently graphical user interface, with a number of different windows appearing on the screen at any point in time, one of which would be a window to depict a graphical display of the game's world, while several other text-based windows would be available for prospective game designers to create narration, characters, in-game items, and scripts for the underlying game engine to execute when various events would occur within a game's world. While initially World Builder was designed for Appleton's own personal use, which he would leverage when he created his own point-and-click adventure game, Enchanted Scepters, Appleton would eventually join forces with Dark Castle creator Silicon Beach Software to publish World Builder for the Macintosh, providing future adventure game designers everywhere with a tool they could use to create their own games without requiring much in the way of software programming expertise. World Builder would become insanely popular, and would result in a number of adventure games being developed over the years, all of which helped to usher in the point-and-click style of adventure game during a time when adventure games on the more pervasive IBM personal computer still used text-driven interfaces for the majority of those titles. Interestingly, as Appleton was in the process of bringing point-and-click adventure games to the masses, or at least the various individuals who had purchased an Apple Macintosh, other individuals across the Macintosh landscape were beginning to pursue their own adventures in point-and-click gameplay. And one of the companies that was striving to be on the forefront of this new adventure game innovation was ICOM Simulations. ICOM Simulations did not begin its life as a company focused on video game development. Instead, the company was founded back in 1981 as Trademark of Quality, or TMQ Software, and the intention behind that company's founding was the creation of decidedly non-game-oriented software, most prominently productivity applications and tools, which, like we've talked about previously, were some of the most widely used pieces of software in the early computer industry, as computers had been designed as productivity machines, not recreational entertainment devices. And TMQ Software, for its part, did what it could to continue promoting computers as primarily productivity devices, as the majority of its early success came about as a result of the database application Filefax, which company co-founder Todd Zipnick had created for the Apple II computer platform in 1983. TMQ's other co-founder, Craig Erickson, had seen the potential in Zipnick's creation, though Erickson did not want to keep creating productivity software forever. He believed that Filefax's success could potentially allow TMQ to expand beyond mere productivity applications into the less developed, though potentially still lucrative, computer and video game industry. Only here, the company faced a little bit of a hurdle. TMQ had a talented staff, but none of them had ever worked on a game before, other than Erickson himself, who had created a text-based adventure game years earlier called The Curse of Crowley Manor. While TMQ could have potentially decided to start developing games from scratch, a different opportunity would arise that would allow them to begin dipping their toes into the game industry, with decidedly less risk than if they had ventured off on their own at the start. And that opportunity would involve one of the biggest companies in gaming at the time, that being, you may have guessed, Atari. Atari was always looking for ways to expand their arcade and console gaming footprint into other adjacent markets, and in the process, they began to look for talented companies to begin porting their titles to various computer platforms like the Apple II, Commodore 64, and IBM-compatible PC. Well, it turns out that one of the companies that Atari would contract with was none other than TMQ Software, and under the terms of their agreement, Atari would pay TMQ to port their games to various computer platforms, with Atari providing the intellectual property and TMQ providing literally everything else, from the software development to the packaging to printed instruction manuals. For TMQ and Craig Erickson, however, this was an opportunity too good to pass up, so shortly after they entered into the deal, TMQ would begin working on ports for popular Atari titles. In the process, TMQ would begin to learn how many popular games were designed, a sort of learning through observation, coupled with on-the-job training with coding those games for platforms that they were never intended to run on. As TMQ continued working on these ports and developing their own internal game development skill set, Erickson started to consider that the time might be right to begin shifting the company's focus away from working on established titles and instead venture out to develop their own original video games. And in particular, Erickson believed that creating a brand new, state-of-the-art adventure title would be the most lucrative and interesting avenue to explore. Like I had mentioned, Erickson had previously created a text-based adventure years prior entitled The Curse of Crowley Manor, though he didn't want TMQ's first original game to be constrained by his prior experience, or even the adventure game genre at large that was pervasive across the industry at the time, which, aside from Enchanted Scepters and the World Builder engine, was still almost exclusively based on text parser interfaces. Instead, Erickson wanted to create a game that would take full advantage of the unique mouse-driven interface and graphical elements that came with every single Macintosh computer, which he believed would help evolve the traditional text-driven adventure game formula to become more graphical and more immersive than any adventure title that had existed up to that point. He didn't want to shortchange the story in favor of graphics and usability, though. He wanted the best of both worlds. A rich, narrative experience filled with puzzles to solve, characters to interact with, and environments to explore. The only difference was, he wanted to put the player more in control of the action than ever before, and he wanted to eliminate the text-based barrier that could sometimes make current adventure titles difficult to understand and hard to play. To put it simply, Erickson wanted to create a point-and-click adventure game. It was this goal, and the broader desire for the company to develop original games, that drove TMQ Software to be rebranded as ICOM Simulations, with work on their very first title, the point-and-click adventure game Deja Vu, beginning shortly thereafter. When the ICOM team sat down to begin designing Deja Vu, they knew that they were facing an uphill battle, primarily because, outside of the World Builder engine we had discussed previously, there simply wasn't another framework for creating an original point-and-click adventure game around this time, and there were very few examples to refer to that might have helped to shape the direction of ICOM's future title. So, rather than attempt to use the limited tools available in the market at the time, the team decided to develop their own adventure game engine, which internally would be known as the Filter Engine, a piece of technology that would end up forming the foundation for their forthcoming game. And here, the Filter Engine would end up using a number of the interface elements and design paradigms that were already present in the base Macintosh user interface, which, like we mentioned, was widely seen as intuitive to use by the general population. ICOM figured if they could take some of those common Macintosh interface elements that people were already used to and put a game-centric coat of paint on top of them, then perhaps they'd be able to create an adventure game that would be more approachable than the often fiendishly difficult text-based adventures of the time. That goal led to the team imbuing the Filter Engine with a number of features that, while unique from a gaming perspective, almost directly inherited from concepts already present in the Macintosh ecosystem. Take, for example, the concept of item hierarchies. When users would access and use a Macintosh, the computer's file system was designed to allow for a series of nested folders and documents, both from an organizational perspective as well as to logically mimic the kinds of concepts that existed in the physical rather than digital world, like what you'd often see in file cabinets containing various folders and documents in office buildings of the time. Unlike primarily text-based computers, the Macintosh provided a visual way to mimic this kind of physical file cabinet concept in a digital form, with users able to store a series of folders on their computer, each of which might contain other folders or documents, with the only limit being the extent to which an individual wanted to organize their own personal desktop environment. This concept would prove very popular, and incidentally would form the foundation of not just future Macintosh iterations, but would also form the concepts behind a lot of Microsoft Windows' earlier graphical user interface efforts. It was that influential. ICOM Simulations decided to mirror this kind of concept, albeit in game form, which the team believed would allow for an intuitive and immersive experience for players. In the world of Deja Vu, this would manifest itself as the game's item hierarchy system, which would allow for various objects to be stored within other objects, with real-world logic dictating how deep that system would go. As an example, let's say your character was wearing a trench coat. Well, that trench coat might have pockets, and in those pockets might be other objects, like a gun, a lighter, some loose change, and a wallet. And those objects might by extension be capable of holding other objects. As another example, a wallet might contain a driver's license or some spare cash, all things that mimicked the real world pretty closely. What you couldn't do, however, was store a gun in a wallet because, well, that simply doesn't make any sense. I know, that sounds like a really simple thing to understand conceptually, but actually creating an engine that knew which objects could be nested within others and which ones couldn't took a fair amount of programming time and design work to get just right, especially when you consider that the goal with Deja Vu was to create an experience that felt real, which meant that these kinds of physical constraints that are taken for granted in the real world had to be explicitly considered and developed for inclusion in the game's engine, a step that the team felt was necessary to truly immerse players in their forthcoming adventure. When you consider that adventure game inventories of the time consisted solely of a text-based list of items rather than visual imagery and icons, and when you consider that exploring game worlds in those games were similarly driven by text descriptions of what objects might be hidden in another object as opposed to visual depictions of embedded objects, you can very clearly see how advanced ICOM's efforts were in comparison to other adventure game developers from the early to mid-80s. Another aspect of that drive for immersive gameplay was the desire to eliminate nearly all keyboard inputs for navigating and interacting with the game world and its characters. Rather than needing to type commands into a text parser, players would instead be allowed the opportunity to point, click, and drag their way through the game, with a series of common commands appearing as on-screen buttons to click, similar to a very early instantiation of a SCUM engine-like interface, while most world interactions could be accomplished by either using those commands on in-game objects, or simply pointing and clicking at objects that might appear in the game world. While the game engine would be designed to include text-based narration to enhance players' understanding of the game's story and its world, the actual interaction with that world would be designed as an entirely mouse-driven affair, something never before attempted to this extent in a prior adventure title. That degree of interaction was married with a mature, gritty story that the team hoped would feel like a pulp detective novel, complete with shifty and shady characters, an amnesiac protagonist, and a series of dangerous and potentially deadly situations to navigate and solve in any number of ways. Unlike many of Sierra's earlier adventure titles that used text to convey information about the game world but didn't really provide a compelling and deep narrative experience, ICOM was focused on delivering both an intriguing narrative as well as a visually impressive and interactive world, representing a combination of gameplay, visuals, and interactivity that had simply never been seen in an adventure title before. Eventually, all of ICOM's work would culminate in the release of Deja Vu for the Apple Macintosh in October of 1985, at which point the game's engine was rebranded as the MacVenture engine, with Deja Vu becoming the very first MacVenture title released on the market. MacVenture, as you might have surmised, was a contraction of the words Macintosh and adventure. And over the years that would follow, ICOM would be responsible for bringing 3 additional MacVenture titles to the market, including a direct sequel to Deja Vu, as well as the more fantasy-inspired Shadowgate, and of course our game of the day, Uninvited. Uninvited, and really all of the games published under the MacVenture label, would share the same interface elements, the same general gameplay, and the same level of point-and-click interactivity as Deja Vu. ICOM, though, was always interested in creating a completely unique story and setting for its games to immerse players in. For Deja Vu, that meant a gritty, pulp-style detective noir mystery. For Shadowgate, that meant castles to explore, torches to light, dragons to defeat, and treasures to hopefully acquire. And for Uninvited, that meant taking the well-known haunted house kind of setting seen in countless movies, television shows, and books, and adding in a dose of point-and-click adventure-driven interactivity. While the stories included with each of the MacVenture games would be dramatically different, the overall gameplay and structure of each game would be very similar, driven by the fact that they all shared the same engine. They may not have known it at the time, but ICOM had unknowingly created one of, if not the, first standard and reusable point-and-click adventure game engine in history, predating Sierra's and LucasArts' more well-known point-and-click engines by years. From a commercial perspective, the entire MacVenture series would be incredibly successful, with over 2 million copies of the 4 MacVenture titles sold over the course of their respective lifetimes. A truly impressive accomplishment for a company that began its life developing business productivity software. Returning to Uninvited specifically, upon its release in June of 1986, the game would be critically acclaimed, with various publications claiming that the game exceeded the already high bar set by ICOM's first release, Deja Vu, with the game's graphics, audio, and mouse-driven interface being noted as being even better than what gamers had seen a year prior with Deja Vu's release. While some critics would claim the game's puzzles were a bit on the confusing side, that did nothing to dissuade interested adventure gamers from checking out ICOM's second full-fledged point-and-click release, which in the eyes of many was a unique and engaging adventure game experience, just like ICOM's first game, Deja Vu. Over the years, the quality of ICOM's MacVenture series would be widely recognized and respected, and eventually, the entire MacVenture series would end up being ported to a number of different computer platforms, as well as home consoles like Nintendo's 8-bit NES. Each of those ports would include different improvements and features beyond the base Macintosh version of the game, with some featuring colorized graphics, others featuring higher resolution visuals, and some even adding music to the experience, all of which were attempts to further modernize the original Macintosh experience beyond its somewhat more humble origins. It's a true testament to the popularity of the MacVenture games, as well as how intriguing the underlying MacVenture engine was in comparison to other adventure games of the time, that the games were ported so extensively in such a short period of time, especially when you consider ICOM Simulations was not what anyone would consider to be a high-profile game development studio. It turns out that well-designed gameplay experiences trump brand name recognition any day of the week. With Uninvited and the MacVenture series a definitive success, ICOM Simulations would continue to become more popular, though still not nearly as popular as other adventure game developers of the time. Regardless, ICOM would continue developing games for the rest of its lifetime, including after its acquisition by Viacom New Media in 1993. While the company would explore a variety of gaming genres over the years, a core part of its focus remained in the point-and-click adventure game space that it had helped to pioneer back in the mid-'80s, with the creation of the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective series of titles, several Beavis and Butt-Head point-and-click adventures, and a number of other standalone efforts rounding out the company's gameography before it was unfortunately shut down in 1997. And that company shutdown is most certainly an unfortunate circumstance. Because, while ICOM Simulations might not have quite the same name recognition as the Sierras and LucasArts of the world, that in no way diminishes its contributions to the adventure game genre, which I would argue were as significant as any of the contributions from the adventure game behemoths of the day. ICOM was able to capture lightning in a bottle by leveraging the unique capabilities of the newly released Apple Macintosh to create a series of games with features that were far more advanced and immersive than the majority of its adventure game development peers, and Uninvited is a perfect encapsulation of the secret sauce that made ICOM and its MacVenture series so popular in the mid to late 80s. Even though ICOM no longer exists today, and it's not spoken about quite as reverently as other more successful and popular adventure game development studios, ICOM was undoubtedly an influential force in the early adventure game market, and its MacVenture series remains an important and critical set of releases in adventure game history. As far as Uninvited goes, the story surprisingly doesn't end there, as just 1 month ago, an announcement was made that work on Uninvited 2 is now underway. The company working on that title, Zojoi, is actually made up of former ICOM Simulations employees, and they've ported, remastered, and remade several prior ICOM titles over the last 13-ish years, including completely reimagined entries in the Shadowgate series, ports of the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective games, and, most pertinent to our discussion today, the eventual release of a true modern sequel to Uninvited. While it's not clear when Uninvited 2 will be released, the fact that there's still work being done to keep ICOM's original works alive, and even add to their pedigree, is a testament to just how influential ICOM and its games truly were. My question, as I sat down to begin playing Uninvited, was, does the game, like the other MacVenture titles I've played over the course of my gaming career, still hold up today? Or would it fail to grip me the same way ICOM's other games had? We're going to dive even deeper to address that question right now. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Uninvited today versus when it was released over 30 years ago for the NES version, or if you are a Macintosh gamer, almost 40 years ago. So like I mentioned earlier, when I sat down to begin making this episode and to begin preparing for talking about Uninvited, my goal was to play the NES version of the game over the Macintosh original, simply because I have great nostalgia for Deja Vu and Shadowgate, both on the NES. I never played the Macintosh originals of the MacVenture series back when I was younger, but I did play Deja Vu, I did play Shadowgate, and I loved them. And having never played Uninvited on the NES, I figured, well, that's a gap, and I wanted to fill that gap. So when I started preparing for this episode, I knew I was going to play the NES version of Uninvited, and that's primarily where our discussion is going to focus. You're going to find out that we actually go a little bit beyond that for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. But for the purposes of the start of our discussion, we are focusing solely on Uninvited for the NES. So let's talk about the general game structure for Uninvited. Like we've been talking about, Uninvited does utilize a point-and-click interface. The big thing here is that rather than using a mouse to navigate the game world or interact with objects or characters or use items and solve puzzles, because we're talking about Uninvited on the NES, we are talking about using a controller to control that point-and-click interface. And honestly, it's really not that bad. I know that using a controller and your directional pad to move an arrow around the screen as an analog for using a mouse is not quite as good as using an actual mouse. That is a simple fact. It is a little bit imprecise. There are some areas where moving your cursor around can be a little bit slower, and especially because of the imprecision of moving a cursor with your directional pad, it's not quite as good feeling. It doesn't feel quite as natural as using a mouse to navigate a point-and-click world. But honestly, it's not all that bad. And interestingly, I think that the developers behind the NES port for Uninvited recognize that there could be a little bit of tedium there, especially because of the speed of the cursor. So there are some shortcuts that exist to make navigation a little bit easier. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But regardless, going into this, just recognize that playing Uninvited on the NES is not an ideal experience for a point-and-click adventure game. Now let's talk about the overall interface for the game and what you actually see when you sit down to begin playing Uninvited. The overall screen and the interface for the game has a few different parts that you'll have to get used to as you continue to play the game. The first, and probably the most obvious, is the actual window or viewport into the game world itself. This is where you see the actual world that you'll be navigating in the game. You see all of the objects that you could potentially interact with. You see, on occasion, some characters that you can interact with. This is your physical view into the game world. And the big thing with NES, or the NES version of Uninvited, is the fact that those visuals are all color. They are all color graphics because the NES ports of the MacVenture series were all kind of touched up a little bit in terms of at least overall color in the graphics. The original versions of the MacVenture series were black and white because that was a limitation of the original Macintosh. The NES does not have that limitation, but at the same time, the NES graphics are, to a degree, a little bit less full-featured than what you would see in those original black and white visuals. Regardless, the viewport is where you're going to be interacting with the game world. You also have your inventory, which takes up the right-hand side of your screen. And in Uninvited, it's presented as though it's a memo pad. So you're not going to see a bunch of different objects or actual graphical representations of objects in your inventory. You're going to see a list of all of the different things that you could have potentially picked up. And in Uninvited, there are a ton of things that you could potentially pick up, not all of which are incredibly useful. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. Moving back to the interface though, there's also a mini-map on the bottom left of the screen, which will help with navigation. And the way it works is every time you enter a room, you're going to see a small square in that mini-map. And that mini-map might contain a number of other smaller squares. Those small squares on the minimap screen represent different entrances and exits from the room that you might be in. So rather than having to click on a door to open it within the actual visual viewport of the game, you could simply click the move button and then click on the square in that minimap and you'll accomplish the same exact thing. You might think that this is a little bit superfluous to actually being able to navigate the game world visually, but it does provide a useful shortcut for navigation. And also provides a way of actually navigating certain scenes where you cannot see the doors that exit or enter from a given room. Because there are some rooms where you go into it, you see the visual on screen, but you can't actually see the exits from that room. The only way to know that an exit exists is by seeing it on the minimap. Also important and part of the interface is your verb command list, which takes up the bottom center of your screen. Uninvited is designed very similarly to an early SCUM engine game that you might have played from LucasArts, because the way you interact with the game world in Uninvited primarily is by choosing verb commands and then interacting with objects or characters or features within the game world. In Uninvited, you do have a verb command list. We'll talk through each of them in just a minute, but think of it as a very early SCUM kind of game, because early SCUM games had a bunch of verbs. Some of them were more useful than others. Some of them were used only occasionally before LucasArts figured out which verbs really needed to be on there and streamline their overall interface. Think of Uninvited, and by extension the entire MacVenture series, as being an example of an early SCUM game, albeit one released before any SCUM games actually existed, before the SCUM engine itself actually existed, at least in their original Macintosh forms. And then finally, there are buttons for interacting with yourself, as well as a save button in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. The save is useful, but not as useful as you might expect, and I'll explain why that is a little bit later. Anyway, that is the general interface for the game. Let's talk a little bit about the verbs and how you can actually interact with the game world. So you have around 7 different verbs that make up the commands on your screen. You have the fairly traditional exam or examination, which basically means if you click that and then click an object on or in the game, you will be able to get some sort of flavor text or description of what you're looking at. This can be useful because certain items and certain objects hide secrets that you would never know simply by looking at the graphics on the screen. So examining things is very, very important. You also have open and close, and actually I take that back. There are 8 verbs. I had kind of combined open and close into one, but they are physically separate verbs within the game world or on the game screen within the interface. So you have open and close, which, as you might expect, will open things and close things. Not really exciting, but something that you absolutely need if you're going to be playing a game. You also have take, which, as the name implies, allows you to pick things up from the world and add them to your inventory. You have use, which lets you use those items, although in some cases you can't simply use the item by itself. Occasionally you have to do something else on them. There is a specific example very early in the game where you encounter a ghost. And if you've gone to a certain portion of the game, you may find a vial of liquid, which is called, I think it's called No Ghost or something like that, or Ghost Off. It's basically a ghost repellent. Well, let's say you encounter that ghost again. You go up to them, you say, use Ghost Off or No Ghost with the ghost, and you die. Well, that's because you didn't open the vial of the ghost repellent before you use it. So just some additional interactivity there that I wanted to mention, because not everything requires a single command in order to use effectively. Sometimes you have to combine some of these verb commands together into a chain in order to actually solve the quote-unquote puzzles in the game. You also have a hit verb, which allows you to hit different things, presumably punch them. I will say that this is used in exactly one spot in the entire game. There is only one location that I'm aware of where hit is absolutely required to be used. Other than that, it is a totally useless verb within Uninvited. In Deja Vu, hit was actually used much more because you would encounter all sorts of characters on the street that you might want to punch in the face. Hit was much more useful in that game. Hit here, at least from what I found, is really not used at all. There's also a leave button, which all that does is allow you to leave objects that you might have picked up in your inventory and leave them at certain predefined locations within the game world. You cannot leave your items everywhere. You have to only leave them in certain locations, and the only reason you would want to do this in Uninvited is if your inventory is getting way too large and you're having a hard time navigating all of the different inventory screens to try to find the item that you want to use. Leave here really doesn't serve much of a purpose, because unlike Deja Vu, where the end of the game, it's basically required for you to leave certain items, otherwise you might incriminate yourself. In Uninvited, the leave verb is absolutely unnecessary, unneeded, at least in the NES version of the game. Because in the NES version, your inventory is bottomless. You can pick up literally anything you come across that is interactable, and you can keep them in your inventory. In the computer version, in the Macintosh version, you actually do have an inventory limit. And spoiler alert, we are going to talk about the Macintosh version in this episode, despite the fact that I did not plan to do that when I originally started planning this whole discussion out. And then finally, you have a speak verb, which allows you to speak with characters in the game, which is also incredibly not useful. There's really not all that many characters to speak to, and oftentimes when you try to speak to certain characters, they will ultimately simply try to kill you. So the whole speak thing, I don't know, take it or leave it. There is some flavor there. I mean, you can use speak on different things, and you can get a little bit of additional flavor text to you, and there are some secrets in there where if you speak with certain ghosts, you might be able to find some neat little Easter eggs that existed in prior games like Deja Vu or Shadowgate. But really, speak is not all that useful. So as I look at the verb command list, there's really only a handful that you're going to use throughout the game predominantly. You're certainly going to examine things, you're going to open and close things, which probably could have been consolidated down to a single individual verb command, or you could have simply bundled that with use, because if you're using a door, what the heck are you using it for if you're not opening it or closing it? But regardless, you have examine, take, use. Those are like the 3 verbs that you basically need in order to make your way through Uninvited. Like I said, you will have to use hit in one specific situation, and you could use some of the others, but if I boil down the interactions in Uninvited to just a core set of verbs, you look at stuff, you manipulate it, and you pick it up. That's it. That is all there is to the game. That's not to say that the game isn't deep or that it's shallow, but I'm simply saying that the overall interactivity here is fairly limited and makes sense given the fact that this was a very early point-and-click adventure game. Now, the cool thing is that other than using the verb commands, because typically you do have to use the verb commands, you select a verb, you select an object, and then something happens. You do have some shortcuts built into the game as well, which makes overall interaction a little bit easier, which is definitely useful on the NES because, like we were talking about earlier, navigating a point-and-click world with your controller is not nearly as natural as using a mouse. So, by default, if you click on an object without selecting a verb command, you will examine that object, which is very useful because you probably want to examine most of the things in the game world, simply because you want to learn more about the game world, and also because there are some clues that are hidden within the game world that you would have no way of knowing about unless you examine various objects within that world. There's also shortcuts for opening a door, because if you click on that and a door is closed, it will automatically open it, which was definitely a nice touch. And if you click on that open doorway, you will then navigate to the next room. So there are some shortcuts built in here. You can also hit the select button on your controller, which will automatically warp your cursor around the different interface elements on the screen, which is definitely a nice touch. So if you're over in the viewport version of the interface or the viewport area of the interface and you're looking at different things and you want to go to the use verb, well, you can hit select on your controller a couple times and your cursor will eventually warp down to the verb command list, which will let you select use and then go back up to the viewport to use whatever you're trying to use. So there are some shortcuts built in that do take away from the general tedium of trying to navigate the game world using your controller. Moving beyond that, the general concept of Uninvited is similar to pretty much every other point-and-click adventure game ever created, in that you navigate a game world, you interact with the environment of that world, you pick up items, you use those items in logical and sometimes illogical ways, you experience a narrative that's hopefully gripping, and in this case scary, and you solve a variety of puzzles to help you progress through the game. And just looking at Uninvited from that perspective, I can definitively say that it is a point-and-click adventure experience, even though your main source of interaction with the game world is via a controller and not a mouse. You might think that our discussion could simply end there, because I'll tell you right now that the graphics in Uninvited are fine, the music is quite good, the general story setup, while very simple, is passable, and the controls and mechanics work well despite the limitations of the NES controller in comparison to the more refined and accurate computer mouse. However, there's actually more to unpack here, because while I wanted to love Uninvited, just like I had loved Deja Vu and Shadowgate, I ended up having a significantly different experience here and ultimately was very let down by Uninvited. Now, I've got to talk about why I've been let down, and I'm going to avoid spoilers for the most part because, like we don't really go into spoilers in any of our game discussions, or at least the majority of them. But I do have to talk about certain things within the game that really fell flat for me. The first one is just generally navigating around the game world. There are a ton of things to interact with in Uninvited, a ton of different objects. Many of those objects are very small on the screen, and I loved the diversity of those environments and the fact that those objects existed in the first place. But, like I mentioned, using the Nintendo controller is a little bit imprecise, and trying to get your cursor on the exact object that you want, especially when they're sometimes really, really small, can be challenging. It makes it difficult to actually interact with the thing you're trying to interact with. At the end of the day, this isn't a huge deal, but it is the start of what I would consider less than ideal design decisions. And one of those less than ideal design decisions that kind of plays hand in hand with navigating the game world and the imprecision of your controls is the number of objects in the game world that have absolutely no bearing on the game itself. Look, I love the complexity of the environment and the amount of objects that you can possibly interact with. But in this case, the number here borders on the obscene. There are so many useless items. And the thing is, those useless items don't sound useless when you originally examine them. You might pick up a bunch of different vials of liquid, one red, one blue, one brown, let's say, and you're holding these vials of liquid in your inventory because you're assuming, as almost anyone would if you've played a point-and-click adventure game. Well, I'm going to use those vials of liquid for something in the future. I'm going to need to combine them and maybe make a magical potion, and then use that potion to defeat a ghost or to solve a puzzle or to make a magic door appear. And I was really excited for all the different puzzles that I thought were coming to me in Uninvited, because there are so many things, so many objects in the game world sound interesting, and you pick them up. You always pick them up because you're playing an adventure game. Who here plays an adventure game and doesn't pick up every single item that you could possibly pick up? Nobody. Because that's not the way you play a point-and-click adventure game. Is you pick up everything you can. Well, in Uninvited, that is a detriment because there are so many objects that you cannot use, so many red herrings, and all of those red herrings do obscure your ability to solve puzzles. And speaking of puzzles, man, the puzzles here just didn't feel all that great. Some of the puzzles felt very random. You know how the early adventure games by companies like Online Systems and Roberta Williams in particular kind of had a bunch of moon logic there, where who the heck would ever figure out how to solve some of these things unless you were just trying all sorts of interactions or potentially looking at a walkthrough or a guidebook? Well, there are some of these in Uninvited as well. There are situations where you have to, or I'll give one spoiler. I actually have 3 that I wrote down. I'm going to do one spoiler just to give you an example of the kind of thing that you're going to encounter here. At a certain point in the game, you will pick up a jar. And first of all, there are a lot of jars in Uninvited, but you will pick up a jar that's actually important at some point in the game, and you'll try to open it and you can't. Well, what are you going to do with that jar? There's any number of things you could potentially do. You could try to drop it or throw it on the ground thinking it might break. Nah, that's not going to work. You could try smashing it with something. No, you got to find that one specific thing that you need to smash the jar with. And in this case, it is a gigantic two-handed axe. You need to use a two-handed axe on that jar. That is the only interaction I'm aware of that will actually open that jar, which, by the way, is glass and does behave like the physical properties of glass you would expect. Meaning, why couldn't you smash it on something else? Why do you need to use a two-handed axe? I'm picturing it now. You take this jar, and it's not a big jar, but you take this jar, you put it on the ground, and you think to yourself, how am I going to open this thing? I know. Let me grab my two-handed executioner's axe from my backpack and swing it right at the jar. Well, of course, that does work because axe versus jar, axe wins almost every time. But why? Why would that be the solution to this puzzle? There's no real in-game text to even suggest that that interaction would make sense, other than figuring, if I smash an axe against the jar, you better believe that jar is going to break. But there were other examples of this as well, and I just started thinking to myself, why? Why couldn't there be more logic here? This kind of illogic was not part of Deja Vu. Deja Vu was actually fairly logical. It was set in the real world. You had to do real world things. Now, certainly some puzzles were harder than others, and there was challenge there. But I don't remember any moon logic puzzles from Deja Vu. And I'm thinking back because it wasn't that long ago that we played it. I'm thinking back and I don't remember any. No, I'm off the top of my head. No, I'm sure there was something in there, but I remember Deja Vu's puzzles being entirely logical. You might not figure it out the first time because Deja Vu is a game, and many of the MacVenture games are designed to encourage repeat playthroughs. You figure out what works, you figure out what doesn't, you go back, your next playthrough, you do a little bit better. And of course, Uninvited does have a time limit of sorts, or at least the original version did. The NES version does as well. We'll talk about that one in a couple minutes. But just like similar games like Deja Vu, where there was a time limit around having to get your memory back before you can actually be safe, so to speak. And in Shadowgate, the whole concept of torches, if your torches run out, it's effectively game over. So this game, all the games in the MacVenture series have some sort of time limit there, which does encourage repeat playthroughs. As you get better, you get more efficient and eventually beat the game. Uninvited has that as well, but the fact is, the puzzles that you have to solve throughout the game are not really all that logical in many situations. I also have to mention the random deaths in the game because, once again, like in early Online Systems or Sierra Online title, there are a lot of deaths here, and some of them are simply ridiculous. I mean, there are situations where you have to do a single specific action, And that action may not necessarily make sense to you, but it is what the game expects. Otherwise, you will die a vicious death. Now, I will say some of those death scenes, or at least the graphics on the screen, actually look pretty darn good, and they are kind of spooky. At least if you were younger playing this game when it first came out, I could see it being kind of spooky. As an adult, there's really no scare here, which is fine. I mean, I didn't really expect to be super scared playing Uninvited as an 8-bit title, but I will say that the graphics are effective in these various death scenes. They don't really show anything gory or gruesome, but they do show the ghost that's ripping you from limb from limb, and it's effective. I will say that that's definitely effective. But the general act of dying in this game, you can die a ton of different places, and sometimes deaths don't always feel fair. Luckily, there is a continue system built into the NES version of the game that effectively resets your playthrough to the prior screen with all of your progress intact, which is an awesome user-friendly touch. Now, like I mentioned, you can also save the game as well, but honestly, if you're playing the NES version, unless you're going to turn the game off, the autosave checkpointing continue system here is really the only thing you need. That does differ from the Macintosh original, where if you fail in the Macintosh original, there is no happy continue and get set back to the last screen you were on. You just lose, and you have to load a prior save. There are a bunch of different random deaths in Uninvited, like we were just talking about. But there is one item in the game, and this is a semi-spoiler, just for everybody to be aware. So if you haven't played Uninvited and you want to play Uninvited and you don't want to understand how to avoid what I would consider to be one of the more random kinds of death sequences in the game, you might want to skip a little bit. But there is a red ruby in the NES version. If you pick up the red ruby, first of all, you look at the red ruby, you examine it, and it says something about, it looks like it's emanating some sort of power. Okay. Cool. I mean, hey, but red rubies are cool, right? I mean, gems, jewels, you want to pick everything up in an adventure game. So let's say you pick it up in the NES version of the title. Well, that then begins the time limit. In Uninvited, the original version for the Macintosh, there is a time limit where basically the longer you spend in the mansion, and really it's all tied to the number of clicks that you do, the number of interactions. That's why I was mentioning that becoming more efficient at playing the game actually lets you beat the game eventually, because the more clicks you do, the further you get to whatever the predetermined time limit is, and eventually if you don't beat the game before that time limit, you fail. So in the original, there was a time limit that's pervasive throughout the entire game. In the NES version, that time limit is tied to this red ruby. If you pick it up, then you effectively enter a time limit of sorts, where as you take different actions and interactions with the game world, the game will have an internal clock that kind of clicks, and on random, semi-random kinds of timing, there will be different images that appear on the screen that suggest that you're slowly going insane, or slowly getting absorbed into the house with the ghosts within that house, or they're trying to kind of capture you, to possess you. And I would say that playing the game, first of all, the time limit is really not a huge deal, because every time you die, like let's say you run out of time and you go to continue, well, the time limit gets reset. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really do much other than add a little bit of additional tedium, a little bit of additional dying that you otherwise would be able to avoid. But the thing, or the issue I have with it, is that there is nothing in the game short of one potential clue that tells you the red ruby is a bad thing. And unlike the Macintosh original, you can't simply leave the red ruby anywhere. There's only a couple of spots in the NES version where you're allowed to leave your inventory objects, which means you're going to be stuck with this red ruby that's going to impart an artificial time limit, which is fine by itself, but there's really no high stakes to it at all, because if the time limit runs out and you hit continue, the time limit's reset, and all of your progress up until the last room you visited is also preserved. So there is definitely some user-friendliness here, which I appreciated, but it also creates a mechanic that is really useless. It does nothing to really make the game better. It really just adds a little bit of additional tedium to the overall experience, and I didn't appreciate that. Anyway, moving on beyond that, there really isn't, and this is one of the other areas that I had an issue with, there's really no true story in the game. Everything feels just a little bit disjointed. There is a setup for a story, and there are some notes strewn about the mansion as you explore it that attempt to convey the overall narrative behind the game's haunted mansion, but it ends up feeling a bit underwhelming to me. And I would also say, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit later as well, there's also a spell system of sorts built into the game, and in the NES version it's simply a list of words, and if you examine them it tells you exactly what those spells do, to the point where you will know almost certainly when to use certain spells. As an example, there's one spell that literally says, it says something to the effect of, if 2 or more block your way, use this. I mean, it uses some more flowery words than that, but it effectively just says that. So if you encounter a situation where you see 2 or more things blocking your way, well, use that spell and you should be good. The Macintosh original gives you some of these spell words, but it doesn't really give them to you explicitly. Actually, I take that back. It actually does give you 2 spell commands that you'll use a few times as you play the game. And I guess the more interactive element there is that you actually have to type those words into a parser within the MacVenture version or the Macintosh version of the game, whereas in the NES version, you simply select the word from a command list and off you go. So, I don't know, the spell system in general in Uninvited feels a little bit uninspired, regardless of which version of the game you're talking about, but in the NES version, it does feel a little bit more dumbed down than the original. The bottom line is that Uninvited for the NES did not scratch the itch I wanted it to scratch. I wanted to experience another great NES point-and-click adventure like Deja Vu, like Shadowgate, and I was entirely disappointed. And at this point, I was thinking to myself, was Uninvited just a bad game? Did ICOM Simulations just totally mess up as they tried to make their second game after they originally made Deja Vu? So I had to know. I had to know if this was an issue with the NES port or an issue with the original version of the game as well. So I decided, even though the focus of this episode is the NES port of the title, I knew that I needed to know if the original was a better experience. I had heard that the original had gotten some critical acclaim, and I knew that the narrative elements and descriptions of the various situations and objects in the original version of the game were dramatically better than what you would see on the NES. The NES cartridge simply couldn't handle all of that text. There wasn't enough space, and the screen itself couldn't handle all of the typewritten text. So I knew that playing the original version would probably give me a better narrative experience, and I was really wanting that. So I decided to play the original version of Uninvited, the original Macintosh version of Uninvited, because I was just so disappointed with the NES version of the game. I wanted to compare the two, and I wanted to see if I was just getting shortchanged by the NES port, or if Uninvited by itself was just not all that great, at least from my perspective. So, what I will say is that the original game does do some things better, but it also does some things worse than the NES version. I will say the graphics, despite being black and white in the original, are definitely more effective at eliciting a spooky atmosphere. The black and white graphics are highly detailed, especially in comparison to the 8-bit colored visuals of the NES version. The black and white version on the Macintosh looks really good. The graphics there are definitely very high quality. The text descriptions also on the Macintosh version are much more detailed. There is no comparison here. The overall feel of exploring the haunted mansion in the original is way better than playing it on the NES. It just feels so much more alive. It feels so much more well-defined and detailed. I loved reading the text descriptions of the original Macintosh version. As far as audio goes, there were several digital audio clips that accompanied the original throughout your playthrough, but ultimately, it was really sparse in the original version. The full soundtrack of the NES version definitely wins here, and the one thing I will say is that all of the NES ports of the MacVenture games had soundtracks that were simply phenomenal, and Uninvited is no exception. Puzzles in the original game, I remember I said puzzles in the current version and the NES version just kind of didn't make all that much sense. Well, the puzzles in the original game are just kind of different, and I'll explain. So even though I knew what I needed to do because I had just played the NES version, I encountered quite a few situations where the puzzles in the Macintosh version, while mostly similar, had many more dead-end kinds of situations. There were a lot of times where I would miss one step, just one step in a puzzle chain, and ultimately would not be able to complete the game. The NES version is much more user-friendly in this regard. I don't think there is any true dead-end state in the NES version. In the Macintosh version, you will need to save and reload your game so many times, even if you know how to play the game and you know what the puzzles ultimately are because you just played the NES version. There are some slight differences, but for the most part, the puzzles are nearly identical. Not quite, but they're really, really close. Even knowing that, the computer version is absolutely brutal in this regard. Now, I will say that the most egregious puzzles in the computer version are even more random and haphazardly placed than the NES version. So much so that some of these should not count as puzzles at all, but should instead be considered simply random things that you need to do that doesn't tie to any story that you've seen within the game. They are entirely random. The worst example of this is if you don't clear out all of the ghosts in the house, you could potentially get to the end of the game, quote unquote, beat the final bad guy, and then unceremoniously end up dead anyway. Turns out that I missed a single ghost that was found in a single room where somehow I would have had to know that I had to interact with a random lamp and then use a spider on the ghost that appeared to make that ghost disappear. None of this had any indication. There was no indication within the game that, number one, ghosts are afraid of spiders, or at least this ghost is afraid of spiders, and there was no indication as to why I would ever need to use that lamp in the first place to make a ghost poof into existence. Completely random, absolutely random, but still required to beat the game. Beyond that, there are a number of other trial and error kinds of situations where you have to do certain things and you don't know what's going to happen until you do them, and that may actually require you to do an additional playthrough. Unlike Deja Vu, though, which I found to be ultimately logical with its puzzles, Uninvited entirely misses the mark for me. It's like ICOM Simulations took all of the good stuff about Deja Vu and said, "We've made this game too logical. For the next one, let's go to the Roberta Williams School of Design to really make our game shine." Now, I'm mostly kidding about the Roberta Williams thing, except not really, because the puzzles in Uninvited do in fact feel like Roberta Williams got her hands on the MacVenture engine, and I've got to say, it really did not work for me. So anyway, Uninvited, regardless of what platform you play it on, really doesn't hold up to Deja Vu, and certainly doesn't hold up to more modern adventure game experiences. The question is, are there aspects of the game that somewhat redeem the disappointing puzzling experience? Well, we're going to talk about that in just a couple minutes. First, though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Uninvited for the Nintendo Entertainment System, the back of the box says, "What a pity about your automobile. And your sister. She came to our mansion for help. But now, I'm afraid she desperately needs yours. Welcome to our humble abode. I regret you'll have to carry on your search alone. It seems we're down to a skeleton staff." Oh my, is that your sister screaming? I hope you're not too late to save her. Horrors. It's becoming grotesquely obvious why all our guests feel so uninvited. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box that show the overall interface and the way the game looks just like Deja Vu and Shadowgate, except in a spookier kind of environment. And I've got to say, yes, 150 million%, this box sells me on it. I told you before that I loved Deja Vu. I loved Shadowgate. If I saw this and I picked it up and I saw the same exact interface, albeit set in a spooky mansion, you better believe I was going to buy this game. I don't know why I didn't know about Uninvited back then. Maybe it's because it came out a little bit later in the NES cycle and we're getting ready. I'm trying to remember exactly the timing, but I know that, I don't know, maybe it just passed me by for some reason. I'm not sure why, but I will say that if I had seen this box back when I was younger, this would have been an immediate purchase. I would have thought, oh my goodness, Deja Vu, Shadowgate, and now a spooky haunted horror mansion kind of game? Sign me up. Anyway, we're going to move beyond the back of the box to start talking more specifically about various aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Uninvited for the NES are nicely detailed, and I did appreciate the colorful environments that were included in the game. Every object in the game is distinct, characters and creatures you see are well designed, and the interface, despite the fact that it takes up a good chunk of your screen, is pretty darn effective at translating traditional mouse-based point-and-click gameplay to a more controller-based medium. It's actually really well designed, and overall, not bad at all. Animations, meanwhile, are mostly non-existent, as most of the game is shown to you via individual screenshots as opposed to animated sequences. There are only a couple of scenes where animations play out, and those are pretty underwhelming, effectively using the least possible animation in a game of this type. I'm talking about things like a ghost that just floats around the screen following a path, like you were dragging some clip art across a document in PowerPoint. Now look, I get it. This is basically a visual novel kind of experience, but if that's the case, I'd argue you should remove animations entirely, as opposed to putting in place the incredibly limited animations that we got. Overall, though, the visuals are fine, but not anything too impressive, and unfortunately, they really don't fully capture the spookiness of the game's environments the same way that the original computer version did. I'm not sure if this is an instance where adding color actually reduces the level of tension and spookiness in the game or what, but the NES version, while looking fine by itself, does lose a little bit in translation from the Macintosh original, whose black and white graphics were surprisingly detailed and effective in conveying a spooky haunted house kind of atmosphere. I also should mention that a number of the graphics in the NES version of the game were censored because Nintendo is Nintendo. Things like you can't have a cross on the screen because that has a religious connotation. There was also a pentagram rug in the original Macintosh version that was entirely removed and I guess replaced with, I don't know, a normal throw rug you get from Home Depot, Lowe's, maybe. Where do you buy home rugs? Amazon. I'm assuming that the NES version bought all their stuff from Amazon because there was no pentagram rug. The pentagram rug, kind of spooky in the original, totally missing in the NES version. There were a bunch of other examples where the NES version was a bit censored, which honestly you kind of expect with a Nintendo game. Anyway, moving on to the sound and music, this is one area where the NES version of the game excels. I loved the music here, with different pieces imparting hope, dread, and tension, and I personally think the music is the highlight of the game. Every single MacVenture port to the NES has been enhanced by the quality 8-bit soundtrack created for those versions of the games, and Uninvited is no exception. Absolutely awesome music. Sound effects, meanwhile, are almost non-existent, so nothing to call attention to here, other than the fact that they may be just a bit too subdued. As an example, hitting something using the hit command barely registers an audible noise, which just feels off. I don't need bombastic sound effects in my adventure games, but I also don't want sound effects that don't add anything to the overall experience. Unfortunately, Uninvited did let me down here. Luckily though, the music saves the day, as the soundtrack is so good, I can completely forgive the lack of meaningful sound effects, and at the end of the day, the music is what will be memorable here. Not quite as memorable as Deja Vu's themes, all of which are permanent memories in my brain, but still an outstanding 8-bit soundtrack. Moving on to the narrative and story, you begin Uninvited driving in a car, And then a hooded figure approaches, which you swerve to get out of the way, you crash your car into a nearby tree, and then you wake up, and your sister, who was driving with you, is missing. Well, of course, you got to go find your sister, so you get out of the car, you find a mansion, and then spookiness ensues. So that is the story setup for Uninvited, and I've got to say, the story setup here is great. It is a little bit traditional, it's not entirely innovative, but there's a reason this kind of story setup exists, and it's because it works and it's effective. The issue is that once you get past that setup, which I did enjoy, the internal story, once you get into the mansion, I just wasn't feeling it. I think there was plenty of opportunity to expand upon the story of the mansion, its prior inhabitants, and what was really happening here. But the NES version did away with so much of the original game's flavor text that it ended up feeling like an afterthought as opposed to a central part of the game, which is a true miss for an adventure game experience. And the fact is, it's not like other ported MacVenture games didn't know how to tell a story. Look at Deja Vu with its fairly frequent cutscenes and in-game notes and scenes that worked so well to convey the gritty detective story at its core. Uninvited missed the mark for me, at least in the NES incarnation. If you really want to experience the story of Uninvited, you really have to play the original release. It's not even a question. You need to play that game to see why Uninvited was praised in the first place when it originally released. Now, I'm not saying that every aspect of the Macintosh version holds up to today's standards, but the text descriptions and the overall narrative, definitely better than the NES version of the title. Overall, the story in the NES version of the game was a complete miss. It could have been made so much more impactful, but as it stands, it was too condensed and restricted to really work for me. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked about the gameplay and controls for the game, along with some of its major missteps, so I'm really not going to rehash all that here. What I will reiterate, though, is that the game's gameplay structure and controls are all fine within the context of an NES adventure game. It's just that the actual content of the game fails to take advantage of those controls and structure to deliver a truly meaningful experience, which honestly is a huge disappointment to me. This is an example of an NES port that had some benefits over the original in which it was based, namely the color graphics and music, but ultimately delivered too stripped down of an experience to have those benefits outweigh its other deficiencies. So you might think, well, just play the Macintosh version. The thing is, though, even that version of the game is ultimately a disappointment. I didn't feel this way about Deja Vu at all, but unfortunately, Uninvited, regardless of platform, mostly misses the mark. So, what is our verdict on Uninvited? Well, I gotta say, this one hurts a little bit, because I have, up to this point, loved the NES versions of previously released MacVenture titles, and I fully expected to enjoy Uninvited as much as I had Deja Vu and Shadowgate. Unfortunately, that was not in the cards for this one, as I believe both the NES version of the game as well as the Macintosh original are subpar experiences that squander a good bit of the goodness ICOM built with their very first title, Deja Vu. Uninvited isn't what I would consider a bad game, but it is a disappointing one, which is why Uninvited for the NES, and the Macintosh for that matter, have just become the newest member on our list of mediocre mentions. You can still have some fun with the game. You just need to be in the right frame of mind, and recognize that this particular early point-and-click adventure has some significant flaws that will almost certainly impact your enjoyment of the title. If you're only going to play a single version of Uninvited, I suppose you should play the Macintosh original, which despite having black and white graphics and minimal audio, still delivers a spookier, somewhat more engaging experience than the NES version of the title. At the end of the day, though, no matter which version of Uninvited you play, the simple fact is that it is overall a subpar experience, which is why Uninvited, in all of its forms, is ultimately deserving of its spot in our collection of mediocre mentions. It is now time for this week's gaming challenges, and they are all, of course, focused on Uninvited. Your first challenge, worth 1 coin, is to cross paths with a ghost. There are a number of ghosts situated within the Uninvited mansion. If you can cross paths with just one, you will earn a single coin. Your second challenge is to discover a maze. Around half of the way through the game, you will find a maze that you have to make your way through. If you can find that maze, you will earn 2 coins. And then finally, for 3 coins, your challenge is to escape the mansion. That means beat the game. Uninvited is not a long game. It does require some repetition and some trial and error, but at the end of the day, it's not that long of a game. If you can escape the mansion successfully, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Uninvited. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the PC real-time strategy title, Constructor. So definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience, and get your comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Constructor. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.